Hi, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. It's wonderful to see so many faces and names. To introduce myself, my name is Emma Brush. I'm a PhD student in English literature here at Stanford. Again, thank you for joining us for this final Arts and Justice workshop of the quarter, which will be a poetry reading and panel discussion among a few groundbreaking poets engaging with the language and practice of the law, and specifically as it intersects with indigeneity and injustice. So as always, thank you to the Stanford Humanities Center for making the series possible, to Professor Jisha Menon for all her work in spearheading and shaping this ongoing conversation. Thank you also to our co-sponsors for this event, the Stanford Arts Institute, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and the Department of Theater and Performance Studies. Thank you finally to all who have joined us today, those returning to this conversation for the first time, and those returning. To our speakers, Layli Long Soldier and Ann Tweedy, and our moderator, Monica Sok, we are deeply honored to have you join us, and we thank you in advance for your generosity and sharing and discussing your work with us today. So before we begin, I'll just offer a quick note on the format of the event. So after we get the chance to hear from each of our poets and speakers, Monica will moderate a group discussion, after which she'll open the conversation to audience questions. So please do post your questions in the chat as they arise. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for today's event, who will introduce our illustrious speakers herself. So Monica Sok is a Cambodian American poet and the daughter of refugees. She is the author of A Nail the Evening Hangs On, which came out from Copper Canyon Press in 2020. Her work has been recognized with the Discovery Prize from 92Y. She's received fellowships from the Elizabeth George Foundation, Hedgebrook, Jerome Foundation, Kundiman, McDowell, the National Endowment for the Arts, Poetry Society of America, Saltonstall Foundation, and others. Sok is a Jones lecturer at Stanford and teaches poetry to Southeast Asian youths at the Center for Empowering Refugees and Immigrants in Oakland, California. She is from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So with that, Monica, thank you so much for being here, and I will pass the floor to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Emma. I am honored to be here to moderate this discussion between Layli Long Soldier and Ann Tweedy. I'm thrilled to be part of this event called Poetics of Law, and I'm also here to learn, as we all are. I just want to remind the audience to ask questions in the chat. I encourage you to write hashtag questions so that I can flag those questions and the organizers can also help me do that. So we'll start with the poetry reading, and then we will also have a conversation between the poets, and then I'll open up the Q&A to the audience. So at this time, I just want to introduce the readers, and Layli will also begin the reading, but I'm going to read both bios. Layli Long Soldier holds a BFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts and an MFA from Bard College. Her poems have appeared in Poetry Magazine, The New York Times, The American Poet, The American Reader, The Kenyan Review Online, BOM, and elsewhere. She is the recipient of an NACF National Artist Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, a Whiting Award, and was a finalist for the 2017 National Book Award. She has also received the 2018 Penn Gene Stein Award and the 2018 National Book Critics Circle Award. She is the author of Chromosomery and Whereas. She resides in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ann Tweedy is a poet and law professor who specializes in federal law relating to Native American tribes, as well as bisexuality and the law. Her full-length poetry book, The Body's Alphabet, was awarded a Bisexual Book Award and was named as a Lambda Literary Award finalist. Tweedy joined the faculty at University of South Dakota Knudsen School of Law in January 2020, after having served most recently as an in-house counsel for the Muckleshoot Indian tribe in Washington State. Her legal scholarship strives to make legally sanctioned injustices to tribes visible. Tweedy earned a JD from UC Berkeley School of Law and an MFA from Hamline University. Please welcome Layli Long Soldier now. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Hi. You have to excuse me because even though it's Zoom, I get really nervous and self-conscious anyway. Although I'm sitting in my own home. But I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having us today. And I'm going to start off with an introduction in our language, just because sometimes it's nice to hear our languages. So Layli Kichita Hanska, Layli Long Soldier, Imachiapi, Da Yahipi Nachante Washte Nabechu Sapi. And so I just said I come here with a good heart and a warm hand or something like that. So even though I can't see you and I can't be with you all in person, I feel I come here with a good spirit. I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to share some work I'm going to begin by reading from Whereas, but I'm going to share some pieces that some of them I have not read before. And it's because I've chosen to read from a section in my book called it's the resolution section. So those pieces are mostly visual pieces. And so they're not the easiest to read. And even myself, I have to navigate, do a little shifting and moving to be able to do that. But I am excited to share them because I like to hear new things too. I like to read new things as well. So I'm also setting the timer on my phone because I have a habit of going over time. So, okay, I'm going to share screen with everyone so that you can follow along and you can see the visual pieces as well. And I don't know if I'll have time. I also wanted to share some new work, but we'll see how it goes. We'll be flexible today. I'm going to, for all of you, anyone who is not familiar with my book or my work, I'm just going to read the introduction to the Whereas section, just to give a little background for where these poems come from. On Saturday, December 19th, 2009, US President Barack Obama signed the Congressional Resolution of Apology to Native Americans. No tribal leaders or official representatives were invited to witness and receive the apology on behalf of tribal nations. President Obama never read the apology aloud publicly. Although, for the record, Senator Brownback, 5 months later, read the apology to a gathering of 5 tribal leaders, though there are more than 560 federally recognized tribes in the US. The apology was then folded into a larger, unrelated piece of legislation called the 2010 Defense Appropriations Act. My response is directed to the apology's delivery, or non-delivery, we might say, as well as the language, crafting, and arrangement of the written document. And if you're curious, you can go to, you can find that apology, that congressional apology online, if you want to read it. I am a citizen of the United States and an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe, meaning I am a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation. And in this dual citizenship, I must work, I must eat, I must art, I must mother, I must friend, I must listen, I must observe, constantly, I must live. So if you happen to go online and look at the Congressional Apology, you will see that it contains, it's organized in 3 different sections. The first section is what's called the whereas statements that sets the foundation for the resolution. So the first section is whereas statements, second section is the resolution, and the last little section is their disclaimers. And so when I approached this project, I actually used that structure as my own because I wanted this project to reflect, I wanted to mirror back the same amount of effort, if not more, in making my response. So I have 20 whereas statements, and most of those statements, you'll see, most of them are like prose blocks and little sort of moments from my own experience, my own family, or family members. And then the second section, I have also 7 resolutions. And I also conclude with my own disclaimers, exempting myself from liability from anything in that book. I just decided to do that. Why not? So I'm going to share, as I said, I'm going to jump into the second section, the resolutions. And the way that I worked with that text is, believe it or not, I actually went through about 4 or 5, I want to say 4 different versions of resolutions before I settled on these, the ones that I'm going to share. So I went through 4 different sets. That's about 28 or 30 poems that never saw the light of day. And the reason it took me so long to get to this, the final sort of version, is because I realized I myself, I was not resolved. I had no resolution. So the way I decided instead to work with the actual text of the document of the Congressional Apology, and to take that text and make pieces of my own to sort of mirror back that language, that congressional language. So rather than sharing personal moments, family history, or community things, this section in particular, it's all from that document, the Congressional Resolution. And the way I worked with it was I sat with that language a long time, and I thought about its impact. And I worked very hard to visually show how that language was affecting me as I said, as a Lakota citizen and a US citizen as well. This is resolution 1. I recognize the special legal and political relationship Indian tribes have with the United States, and the solemn covenant with the land we share. Three, I'm sorry, I'm not reading all of them today, but I'm going to number 3. Resolution 3. I recognize that official, ill, breaking of the Indian. 1. There have been years of 2. Depredations. Excuse me, I'm sorry, my eyesight is bad. 3. Conceived policies and the 4. Covenants by 5. Federal government regarding 6. Tribes. 5. I express commitment to reveal in a text the shape of its pounding. Expresses its regret for the ramifications of former wrongs and its commitment to build on the positive relationships of the past and present to move toward a brighter future where all the people of this land live reconciled as brothers and sisters and harmoniously steward and protect the land together. I commend the inventive crafting of a national resolution, so mindful of boundaries, their boundaries, in their boundaries, located in their boundaries, tribes located in their boundaries, Indian tribes located in their boundaries, recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries, with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries, efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries, reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries, begun reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries, have begun reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries that have begun reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries. Governments that have begun reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries. State governments that have begun reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries. The state governments that have begun reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries. Commends the state governments that have begun reconciliation efforts with recognized Indian tribes located in their boundaries. Ooh, that's a lot to read, hey? Okay, last but not least. And then if I have time, I'm gonna share a few photos with you. This is resolution 2, and it's actually a piece that I like to end most of my readings with. I think of all the pieces, this was one of the most important to me with this idea of land. And I would like to dedicate this piece to my family and my community, if anyone is listening. Resolution 2. I commend this land and this land honor this land, native this land, peoples this land, for this land, this land, thousands this land, of this land, years this land, that this land, they this land, have this land, stewarded this land, and this land protected this land, this land, this land, this land, this land, this land, this. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes sharing some photos just to close here from an installation I did during the time that I was actually writing these pieces. We held an installation on the Pine Ridge reservation at the Heritage Center. And while I was writing, I had this idea. I was curious to hear responses from other people from our community to this apology as well. I didn't know if I was the only one that was sensitive to some of the language and the phrasing. I didn't know if there might be gaps or spaces I'm missing and so on. And so I approached the Heritage Center and asked them if they knew of any space or location where I could have community come and engage with this document. And they actually right away immediately offered their own space, the curators there. So they hosted this installation for 3 months. We called it Whereas We Respond. And what we did is we chose 3 different sections from that congressional document, and we projected the text onto 3 different walls, on the left, on the back, and on the right. The Heritage Center is located on Cloud Horse Indian School. And so on the back wall, I actually projected the text that relates to boarding schools. And it was kind of, I think in a way subversive, because I don't even know if the nuns and the clergy there knew what was going on, the people who had approved the project. But in any case, they let us host it. And if you can see in front here, we put a cart. Okay, that's my timer, so I'll try not to take too long. But we put a cart full of markers, acrylics, graphite, all kinds of things, and invited the young people and actually all ages, the whole community, to come and interact with that text directly onto the walls. This was like the first or second day. It was open. You can see some of these submissions, blood-stained apology. I watched this young man stand there for a long time thinking about what he wanted to submit, what he wanted to write. And then he looked so pensive, and it took him a long time. And then I was really amazed when he was done. We have this young person apologize to my or our grandparents. And we should understand that what we consider a lot of Americans think is just history or the past, it is actually still present within our elders, our grandparents. They lived through some very dramatic and I want to say devastating times. So it's not something that's completely of the past, you know. This is one of my favorite entries. If you're so sorry, give us back the Black Hills. And I loved that because I watched the girls. There was like 2 or 3 girls. They were teenagers. I want to say maybe 15 or 16. And they were all huddled in the corner and talking amongst each other, trying to decide what they wanted to write together. And I couldn't see what they were writing until they were done, and they pulled back. And this still to this day is one of my favorite entries because it was so insightful. And even at a very young age, that our Lakota youth can see through the legalese, you know, and right to the heart of the matter, that an apology is about relationship, and relationships are founded on agreements, contracts. I will do this, you will do this. And the Black Hills certainly is part of our original agreements. And that is, I could give you a whole spiel on that, but it's land that is still contested. The Northern tribes have received money to compensate for the breaking of that contract, but we have not accepted 1 penny of that money. So currently the fund, that money has accrued to over $1 billion from the last I read about it. So anyway, that was beautiful. This was my grandma. My grandma Shah, I was very lucky to have her come, and she has passed away now. I'm not sure if she knew what was going on, that it was an art project, but it was certainly nice to have an elder there from our community, our family, and to spend time with us. You can see this was a few weeks into the installation, and the walls are getting fuller and fuller. I can tell you by the end of the 3 months, people were using step ladders to right at the very top. It was like New York City. There were so many submissions. And that's it. Oh, look at me. I want to stop share because we're not going to talk about Zong now. Hold on. Thank you. I think that I should hand it over to Anne. I wanted to share new work, but we can have that another time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Layli. It's an honor to read with you. And I also wanted to thank Monica and Emma and Anna for organizing, and Monica for moderating. I thought I'd read a couple poems from my book, The Body's Alphabet, and then some from another chapbook called Whiteout, and then some that aren't in either. And they all deal with social justice issues and some with tribal issues, tribal justice. And I also wanted to say I'm on the unceded Dakota land here in, as well as Omaha and Winnebago here in Vermilion, South Dakota. So the first two poems are nature poems, but they do deal with racial justice issues. You just have to wait a little bit, and it gets into that. So this is called Blue in quotes, and it's from The Body's Alphabet. If I said bluebirds and Steller's jays are not really blue, that blueness is a trick their feathers are engineered to reflect, would this mean anything to you, as if other blueness were a state of being separate from perception, or is it? If feathers look blue, doesn't that make the bird blue or blue enough? Or are we to test blue objectively to make sure it's real? And since birds have been tested and fail, the whole avian kingdom may lay no claim to blue. This raises questions I'm not equipped to answer. For example, my Chinese friend who passes as a tribal member isn't Indian because she passes, so maybe birds aren't blue no matter how they are perceived or perceive each other. Or what about that study on race in Brazil where white identifying people were found to have more African ancestry than Black identifying people. So maybe feeling blue is the operative question, but the trouble is we can ask and ask away and the birds will never tell us. It's also possible that being blue in Brazil means something different than being blue in the US, or is blueness determined by who's asking the question so that I can foist my conception on birds throughout the world? But if I couldn't base the question on my own conception, then I could only ever answer a fragment of the question, which may be true after all. And if the categorizers were to decide that blue can no longer apply to feathers, wouldn't blue birds and blue jays be forced to change the names they don't know they have, not to mention great blue herons who don't look blue anyway, except when afternoon lights up their ruffed gray, rendering them too rich and illuminating to settle quietly under the non-color of granite, rainy days, raccoons, squirrels, and ash, all too flat to accommodate the majestic heron who instead was bestowed with the honorary but unachievable blue designation, only to lose it most likely in very short order. And what about Warner Brothers Roadrunner, who's drawn blue, though real Roadrunners are brown streaked in black, save some blue skin near the eye? Could it be that the cartoon roadrunner, that unpreyable prey, that table-turning phoenix is the only truly blue bird, the one real McCoy, the post-hawk archetype that all other blue aves unknowingly aspire to as they fly off into their equally unblue skies? And then another bird poem that deals with, this one deals with colonialism, unnatural selection. A house sparrow roosts in the carport, haloed suddenly by my flashlight. He blinks his black bead of an eye the way I blink when awakened by lamp glow. The book on birdhouse building advises, trap and eliminate this old world finch who harasses native cavity nesters. Though he doesn't fly, I think I can read fear in his shiny eye. Glyphs of guano on the rafter below score an intention to stay. What birder could lure with winter seeds, houses suet only to exterminate? Oh, for a logical heart, for a love that discriminates. His kind, like mine, has colonized not just this tilled valley, but the entire lower 48. It's no human province, is it, to go back to Brooklyn, 1851, and lock those wire cages? We suffer the world as we've made it. I'll read a couple from Whiteout. So this one is called House Built on Sand. I love my husband who loves trains, and so part of me loves trains, even knowing how trains brought settlers west to scatter tribes, then round them like cattle onto reservations that shrunk and shrunk as whites grew hungrier, how buffalo were shot from those trains, then left to die to starve the Indians whose lives depended on them. In America, there is no love without irony. The innocence of the blonde, curly-haired child smiling from the sunbeam wrapper is a lie we've told ourselves to survive. Sometimes, flicking on the light, I try to be mindful that my bursts of vision flare from the deaths of billions of salmon, train wrecked by dams all across the nation, that I am part of the reason grief splays the lives tied to those salmon. Still, sitting in my house on the West Coast, typing an artificial light, I can't help but love my life. And, here's a short poem called Mirage. Sometimes I'm not part of a country that projects its nightmares onto the big screen of the world. I shut my eyes and imagine no one has been harmed in my name or for my comfort or to accord with my nation's idea of civilization or property or wealth. How clear the air of my breath feels then, how uncomplicated to continue drinking in. This one's called Homeland, and it's about teaching federal Indian law, and it's from when I first started teaching, and I was in the San Diego area, and I didn't have many Native students, and it was also a particularly dark time for the cases that were coming out of the Supreme Court. So it's improved a little bit in recent years, which is wonderful, but this was a really dark time. Homeland. Dear Supreme Court, I'm writing to ask if perhaps you can do something different. Like others in my field, I followed your cases about tribes since law school, so roughly 10 years, and read and reread the old ones, hoping to find some kernel of whatever my client needed at the moment. Now that I'm teaching your words, I'm starting to learn them by heart. Working for tribes was difficult, even as an outsider who could get a new job if she wanted. I know you exalt America's dream to see through divides and status and appreciate the true person effortlessly. but the ease with which I could turn away, get a new job, stop reading your Indian law decisions, separated me from the natives I represented. Still, I felt their wounds at the things you had taken, and reading your words that took away promised lands or ability to govern or money or water produced a howl of pain. Sometimes I'd turn to someone I worked with and make a joke of what you'd said to try to quiet it. Do you remember the Kennewick man, that case you wouldn't hear but probably followed? Well, his 9,000-year-old skeleton that the tribes wanted to rebury out of respect and to quiet his spirit, the scientists found a spear lodged in it, an old wound that must have racked his small frame every moment until his death. The tribes and their members are like that. The things you have taken, words that were spoken, dances and practices, reservations, small rights over shrunk territories, pierce a hole that hobbles even the bravest. Working for them, I sometimes felt it in myself, but stopped expecting anything different. Then I was gleeful if in a new decision something wasn't taken. Now I teach students who before my class knew little of any of this. I recount the losses you've inflicted. Most of these students aren't wounded. They walk into class believing in something, believing in you. My job is to describe every injustice neutrally, to take the America they believe in away from them. Slowly at first, the way you did from the 1830s onward, accelerating at certain points and not slowing down now since 1978. I'm not sure you'd want to look in their faces and see what you've done. Perhaps you could care about that if the wounds are too difficult to understand or too necessary. Think back to the student who wants something to believe in, finds instead a homeland incomprehensible except as a thief, so skilled in language, he gets away with it. This is a really short one about working for a tribe called Holiday Remembrance. Come Christmas, the Indian tribe gets flowers from a funeral parlor, a thank you for the dying that's over and done, a nod to deaths still to come. And, I just have a couple more here. This one's called Touring Juvenile Hall as part of the Court of Appeals. So when I was clerking for a judge for the Oregon Court of Appeals, we toured a juvenile detention center, and so this came out of that. Touring Juvenile Hall as part of the Court of Appeals. In the substance abuse cottage, the two youths who told the story of that place had earned the right to wear their own clothes by accumulating good conduct points. School, computers, cafeteria food, sometimes good, sometimes bad, like anywhere, were among the topics on the agenda. Afterward, the superintendent explained how meals really improved morale, and so they worked hard at them. As for outdoor activity, that was up to security, but at least everybody walked to school every day, single file. The violent offender cottage was a bit different. Classes were held inside the building. All the residents studied at their own levels, but attended together. One of the youths explained that they weren't allowed internet access. He also tapped his head and told us with a prideful smile, "There are some real amazing minds here." On the way out to the courtyard where residents could sometimes exercise, we passed one of the school shooters sitting at a table talking with a mentor. He was learning something that would be of use perhaps in another life. Outside, the superintendent outlined the impact of mandatory minimum sentences. Juvenile hall has become a prep school for prison. Our emphasis on communication will disserve them. During the tour, I was fraught with conflict about how much to look, especially at the kids in standard issue sweats who were simply going through the motions. It felt like a kind of betrayal to want to look deeply into a life and never have to live it. And, this one's called Belonging. And it's about when I was looking for a teaching job, an experience I had in DC. Belonging. This is how the mind works. It sees colors, sometimes not registering the thought. The indigenous poet was constantly asked where she was from, her Aztec cheekbones suggesting an unknown. You see, the other cannot walk around just being. The other has to check a box, or the one won't know itself. The one's primacy will be challenged. This is true even on the days when I wander blissfully oblivious, thinking only that I relish difference. Overall, Washington, D.C. was a very brown place. Arriving from the Pacific Northwest, I noticed brownness and was glad to be awash in it. Lots of faces on the metro, on the street, servers in cafes. Hotel workers had African roots, but the class divide manifested only in my self-conscious. Behind the hotel desk stood African Americans in dark suits. Near the counter during the day waited red-suited porters whose accents suggested Africa or the Caribbean. But I never thought, here in this city, Black people serve me, until I got back late after walking city streets, lost in painful shoes, my mind mush from 12 interviews, and asked the suit-clad Black man standing by the counter, what time was checkout? His flustered his troubled eyes jarred my foggy-minded equation of dark skin and suits with service. I flashed back to a friend's birthday party, a short Apache woman describing how white people in garages ask her to park their cars, her personhood supplanted by stature and color, and absorbed with horror, my belonging. And I think I'll close with this one that I had I wrote for a police violence project. A poet called Carrie Wallace was doing this project in the summer of 2015, where she was soliciting a poet to write a poem about every person that died that summer from police violence. So this is the poem that came out of that. Kevin Bajoy, 32, died Baton Rouge, Louisiana, June 20th, 2015. Small-framed and humble as a butterfly, his father says, as he loads his son's car on a trailer to bring home. A Father's Day to manage the logistics of loss. Wouldn't hurt a fly, says Kevin's friend, a gentleman. The friend peddles the neighborhood in search of eyewitnesses. If we could turn the hours back on themselves, will Kevin not to get up from the pavement when the police arrive, to lie still as in reverie? If we could jam the triggers, kill the batteries, abscond the darts. But each revolution of the bike chain is an elegy. We must learn to lose the gentle, humble man to make of ourselves what he might have been. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ann and Layli, for such incredible readings. We are going to move into the discussion portion of our event. And, you know, I was just thinking about how, and Layli, in your work, in your work is so physical. The resolutions that you've written make visible the violence of the English language, the violence of legalese. And I just really appreciate being able to see Resolution 7 as soon as the language state government or reconciliation came in, that just continue to like reduce, minimize, just kind of shrink the presence of Indian tribes located in boundaries. So that being able to see that was really incredible. And Anne, you know, in your poem Homeland, which is my first time hearing this poem, just the way that the speaker speaks directly to the Supreme Court. And, you know, there is an active seeing that's taking place. There is a way that the speaker just relentlessly like implicates the self, you know, and also there's like an intimate voice that comes through while holding accountable the state. And so I just want to say thank you both for the work that you do and just really sitting with the reading and absorbing it. And so I guess I want to begin with some questions. You know, I love the way that the way that community and like your people, Layli, your language, how that blooms in the midst of legal language. And I'm just so like in my own relationship to the English language, I'm so skeptical. I don't trust English, you know, like this is a tremendous time of grief and loss for me and for many of us. And so I find myself gravitating towards like my own ancestral language. But, you know, we're writing in English. And so I'm also wondering, what does it mean that we're writing in English, a colonial language in which violence is rendered? Do we get to make reparations that way? Can we reappropriate legal language to use for reparations or the potential thereof? I just wanted to pose that question first, just knowing the history in which this land is built on.
Thank you. I have a few thoughts, but I don't know if they're going to work to completely answer your question. But the first thing I think about in terms of being people who come from communities and families and who come from homelands where we speak different languages, and yet we are under the rule of the English language. We have to negotiate nation to nation. So our tribal nations, our governments have to work in English. And so, yes, that is the dilemma. And I think back to, I used to work for a place called the Indigenous Language Institute. And I remember there were some folks at the Institute who visited Maori land. And the Maori shared a story about how they were able to retain or regain a certain kind of, some of their rights over their land and their resources and the things that they were able to do by going back to the original agreements, the original treaties, and looking at the translations. And, you know, it all boiled down to one word, and that word was sovereignty. And there was not a direct translation into their language, into Maori language. And they were able to prove that. And that if they had known what this word sovereignty meant, there's no way that the people of their time would have agreed to that. And so they were able to go back and renegotiate some things. And so, yes, we are working, but in those gaps, in that slippage, there's fantastic opportunity. And I can't wait to see what our scholars and our young people are able to do. I'm just a poet, but there are many, I think the young people in our community who are studying law, are older people too, I'm sure. But I think that's a great place to begin. That's something I ask my students to look at. I often, like if I'm working with some of our not necessarily in poetry, but in English classes with tribal students, I'll ask them to go look up our treaties, and not just the text, to look up the original document. And I ask them to go to the last pages where you see signatures of our leaders. And I ask them, what's the first thing you notice? And sometimes there's silence, but you'll see the first thing, usually the first thing you will notice is they're signed with X's. And I ask them, what does that mean? What does it mean when a person signs with X? And I tell my students, this is your opportunity. There's an opportunity there for you to make a different way for us, you know. But going to your question about also as poets, I cannot remember the exact question you asked, but what I want to say is, yes, we get to, that is the beauty of poetry. We get to make up our own words, and we get to redefine words. We get to contribute different contexts for language and different understandings. We can, it can come from the imagination, and it can come from lived experience. It can come from testimony, from witness, from memory, all kinds of things. But we are contributing to how language is understood as poets. And so I can't remember your exact question, but I hope that helps. It's one of the few forms, I think, that allows for that redefining. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Layli. Yeah, that does answer much of the question. And I also want to turn this over to Ann as well. I'm wondering too, Ann, for you as a legal scholar and a poet, how do you move between those two identities? And for you, what are the implications of writing poetry?
I guess I tried to, for a long time, like keep them separate, like compartmentalize myself, but then it seemed like they got more merged when I was, when I had my first full-length book come out. I guess I feel like I am trying to do similar things in a way in the legal scholarship and the poetry, because I'm in some ways like not in all my poetry, but focused on injustice and trying to expose it. And so in both contexts, the poetry I feel like is more of an emotional language for me, so that if I'm responding to something really viscerally, poetry works better for that, and to tell my own story and weave that into some of the stories that I'm witnessing is easier with poetry. But there's some projects that I feel like they could either be they could be legal scholarship or poetry. Like I found out that I knew that some of my ancestors worked on the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation, but I found out that one of them bought land from the tribe at a time when you weren't supposed to be able to buy land from a tribe unless the federal government sanctioned it. So I feel like that could be a poetry book, or it could be a work of legal scholarship, or maybe it could be both. So there's definitely overlap there.
Thank you. And maybe to kind of follow up to that, that question too, and one of my favorite poems of yours is the poem Outing. And in that poem you write, home is the structure you build where no one else will have you. And I was just wondering, how do you see yourself building this structure within your legal scholarship and your work with tribes?
That's such an interesting question. I sometimes feel like my poems come from places I don't understand, so I not that qualified to speak about them, but you know, I guess I feel like scholarship about tribes and the federal law regarding tribes is kind of marginalized, so I can see a resonance in that sense, that a lot of, and I'm grateful to be at South Dakota where it's considered an important subject, but at a lot of schools, it's like something that they wouldn't really prioritize offering even as a class. So I think that there is kind of a struggle that causes a struggle with when you're trying to write about that area, and yet I think of it as one of the most important areas. So so I can see a connection there, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm grateful to hear about that. I think for me, when I think about like legal language, I feel so outside of that, you know. I feel like my people are also somehow erased, or just there's not a lot of clarity. Like I am a daughter of genocide survivors from Cambodia who were displaced to this country, and so I I'm just so curious to know, you know, how we're able to make fuller narratives for our people and advocate. And I think that a lot about your poem 38, Layli, and there's this one particular stanza about treaties that were broken and drafted again, and treaties that reference old defunct treaties. And you make physical that history by like often pointing to land, you know, and you transmogrify that stanza into like this muddy switchback trail to follow. And you write, although I often feel lost on this trail, I know I'm not alone. And this really resonated with me because I often struggle with the English language and just finding my way in it, finding my community in it too. So I'm wondering if you can share with us like the process of navigating legalese, and perhaps speak about like the elders who have guided you on that journey too while writing the book. You know, you mentioned your grandmother, and you showed us this exhibition where your community and everyone was just writing on the walls about what an apology would mean to them, or just how they disagreed with this like fake apology. So I'm just curious to know what your process was navigating the language, and also anything about your elders or community that guided you during the making of this book too.
Well, first of all, I think the interesting thing with legalese, which is in the English language, I think whether it's English or not is sort of arbitrary, because in the legal world, they get to make the rules for what things mean to them. Okay, so an example is, sorry, I get all fired up, but an example is even just the word whereas, that the title of my book, when I was working on this response to the Congressional Apology, I started researching different apologies around the world and different national apologies. I thought about the tone of different apologies, like a verbal apology versus a written, like a congressional document. What is the difference in tone in that language, and so on. And even some of the circumstances around them. So when I was researching, I came across an apology. You know, this apology certainly isn't the first made by the US to particular peoples. So I actually came across the apology to Hawaii, the Native Hawaiian people, made during Clinton's presidency. And so I was reading a few articles around that time, and some of the circumstances around that. First of all, if you read it, it's heartbreaking. So I recommend anyone interested, it's just shocking, because they outline in the whereas statements exactly how they took that land away from the Hawaiian queen. It's devastating. that it just happens in plain sight. How could they get away with that? Okay, so there you are. Some years down the road, I think there were some issues again around land and ownership and resources and so on. And so some of the attorneys or the lawyers working on this case used that apology, brought that to the court as part of, I'm not good with legal language, but I would say what evidence? I don't know. So of course, the US government, the court ruled in their favor. Oh my God, big shocker. But part of the outcome of that trial was to say that whatever was in that apology, in those whereas statements, they could not be held liable. They were not liable for whatever they said. So basically, whatever starts with whereas and ends with a semicolon is within that statement, they are not responsible for. So they could say, whereas I stole your car and I ran over your cat last night, semicolon. Whereas, I burned your, I don't know, all of your clothes. I don't know. They could admit to anything and therefore become almost, by admitting it within that form, become exempt from liability. Does that make sense? It's a double, it doubles back on itself. And so it made me question, was that apology in something offered in sincerity, or was it to exempt them from liability? I mean, it's really something. But what I was fascinated more by then really is the power that is given to one word, whereas, that begins that statement within a whereas statement. And I said, man, these fools, they're making up their own rules. They're just making up the rules for how particular terms in language works, right? So me as a lay person, as just a person who's not educated in law at all, I have no idea. It's a whole other world. So in that regard, it's like I said, to me, it's almost arbitrary that we call it English, right? Right? It's really a language of power, with people making their own rules for what means what, So I think it's entering into that world. If we want to make change, we have to put aside our assumptions about the English language, right? Because it's a whole other world. Yeah.
And I want to also invite you to respond to what Layli said too, especially about the arbitrariness of legalese.
Well, I feel like I learned a lot from what you said, Layli, because I get there's an extent to which I'm just get invested in legalese, and so I feel like when you talk about how people exempt themselves by writing these apologies, and I've seen that Hawaii apology, I think that's a really interesting point, and I can definitely see that. I think there's a way that I just accept that, with a lot of criticism, but that the kind of basic legal framework. But so it's neat to see your perceptions as someone that's not trained in it and maybe can see it with fresher, or not fresher, but a different way of looking at it than I would have as being kind of invested in it. But I think you're right with the apologies that it's like renders them meaningless if then they exempt them from liability somehow.
I am actually, if it's okay, can you hear me? Oh, okay. I'm actually thinking on this subject of a poem. It's right here. it's one of my favorite. Is it okay if I read a little bit of someone else's poetry? Yeah, because it's a poem that really really deals with this this idea of the use of the English language, and it is purposely muddy, as we might say. You know, as I talked about being on that muddy trail that is so difficult to decipher. I'm trying to find the piece here. 1 second. Okay, there's a poet named Shane Rhodes. Are you guys familiar with Shane Rhodes? And a book called X, Poems and Anti-Poems. But anyway, he is, actually, when I first read this book, I thought he was a native writer. I was like, oh my God, this guy's my cousin. I love him. I was carrying this around like a Bible. I was like, this guy is so smart and so on. And then I Googled him and I found out he identifies as a Canadian settler heritage. But the book, in his work, he addresses, he works with the treaty, language of treaties, and he understands that treaties and legalese and all of these things are not native issues. They're all of our, all the citizens. If you're living on this land, it is your concern as well. But anyway, he has this piece called As May Have Been Grunted. I won't read the whole piece, but as may have been grunted from Treaty 5. So this is between the Canadian government and First Nations. And I'll just read a few lines. As aforesaid within, hereunto the hereinafter, thereupon and hereby thereof. That is to say, within the aforesaid, that whatsoever, thereto, that is, the whereas within, thereon, therein, however, that whereas, hereinafter, elsewhere, thereto, unless, therefore, and so on and so on. And so what he's taken is all that extra verbiage, that extra language contained within that treaty. And you're sitting there and put it into one little block. And it's really to show like, man, this is a language collected all that creates, that it feels purposefully to obscure the clarity of the agreement. Like, so that it is difficult to follow. It's a whole muddy document, a muddy situation, especially if you're dealing with nations and leaders whose first language is not English in the first place, right? What are we supposed to do with that? And so there we are. I'm ranting again. I'll leave it at that.
Well, if I can jump in, I love that poem you just read, and what you said last reminded me of the muddying. Reminded me that Isaac Stevens, who negotiated the treaties in Washington State, what is now Washington State, he specifically disallowed them to be translated, for the tribes to have translators into their own language. So they could only be translated at the time into Chinook jargon, which is a really impoverished trade language. So that goes to show that there was a purposeful muddying, I'm sure in many other cases too.
Thank you. And with the couple of minutes that we have left in the event, I want to remind the audience that you're free to ask questions. I have a question here from Amanda Hayes for Layli. She writes, you use space so creatively and differently in whereas. How do you approach creating space or deciding where space goes on the page or in your work?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you, I'm not a fast writer. I'm a very slow writer. So usually a lot of those pieces, considerations about things like space, it's something I usually sit with for a long time. But as sort of a guidepost, I do feel that the visual communicates as much as language. So we know this as a basic, right? If you see a certain shape, you have an emotional response to it, right? Certain shapes, the look of something evokes a response. So, and you know that even if let's take this book, you're flipping through. So often with books, we'll flip through and we'll stop on a page because it looks interesting, right? So before you even enter the language or the subject matter, the writer has created a kind of invitation to you to stop and to pause and to listen, right? So I think that maybe that's just, I can't tell you how I make all the decisions for each piece, but that is something that I think about, that goes into my considerations.
And I also want to ask Ann too, like, what is your creative process as well when you're considering your own poems? And maybe I will also introduce this question as well from Clara Mitchell, who's interested in how absence of words communicates in your work, absences that become pronounced silences. Can you speak a bit about that choice to read the space around the words on the page by including silence? And so I think that question is actually particular to Layli, but I really want to hear more about both Ann and Layli's creative process as well. So Ann, would you begin by speaking about your process?
Sure. Well, I often find I'm inspired by reading other people's poetry. So if I have time set aside to write, I'll often read and then get into revising my own poetry and hope that an idea comes. And I have a journal that I take notes if like an image catches me or a thought. Sometimes I'll have a recurring thought and then eventually that will kind of marinate into a poem. Occasionally, like I have a new chapbook out about my relationship with my mother who was homeless for a time. And so in that, I used more innovative forms and like a survey or grocery list. So that was neat to experiment with. And I sometimes will use like caesurs for to show silence, but I think for me, it's one of the important parts of poetry is not to say too much. And I feel like my identity as a lawyer is kind of in tension with that because I want to explain everything when I'm in that mode. And so poetry is a different mode where I feel like I need to let the reader make their own conclusions or not. And so I just try to put ideas or thoughts out there without making it seem like I think there's a right answer.
Sure. And just to repeat that question too for Layli, can you speak about that choice for you to read the space around the words on the page by including silence?
Yes, I do acknowledge the space around the words, generally speaking, as silence, as a pause. Yeah, but I think that it's as I already said, like it's a big part of my process to. I mean, I don't think for me, poetry is not all about the language. It is also form very strongly. Those are the two wheels always in motion. And so how is the form supporting the content? The form can completely change what we understand of the language within a piece based on the space, based on punctuation or what have you. You mentioned my poem 38, which is separated mostly by little, by the sentence, which I state in the beginning, that this is the vehicle I'm going to choose to write this with. It is with the sentence. And so around each sentence, well, some of the sentences, there might be 2 or 3, but generally speaking, I have put space around each of those sentences and given them their own breath and their own life, you know, and that was really important to me. That rather than, I could have easily condensed all of those sentences into one little, you know, into a paragraph. It would read as an essay, right? But why do that? So we're working as poets and we're working with the way things look. And when I read it, I also give pause between each of those little sentences as the page asks me to. Yeah.
And thank you. And I have another question from Sandra Yannon. Do those working like Ann use the language of power to dismantle the power through arguing alternate interpretations of the law?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that's true. And I also, in terms of like my legal scholarship, I'm trying to show the things that are left out. Like the Supreme Court will say, we have this test, or we have to rule this way against a tribe because it would be unfair to the settlers if we ruled in favor of the tribe. And so like the fairness to the tribes completely left out of the equation. So I'm often trying to shine a light on the things that are just ignored or just glossed over, which I think is, I don't think it's fully intentional. I think that there is an actual difficulty in seeing the court seeing what it's doing, although it's hard to tell.
Thank you so much to everyone here who has come to this event. I am so grateful to be able to learn from Layli Long Soldier and Ann Tweedy today. I wanted to hand it over back to our organizers, Emma and Anna. So thank you again, everyone, for this incredible conversation.
Yes, thank you, Monica. Thank you, Layli. Thank you, Anne, for this honestly just kind of mind-blowing conversation. Thank you for your generosity in sharing your creative work, and also just being so willing to discuss it and these very important questions afterward. I will let you all go, but I welcome you to please join us again. We will, this is the last event in this series for the quarter, but we will be regrouping in the spring. So please look out for communications to that effect. Otherwise, thank you and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you.